Good evening, everyone. Welcome to tonight's Lyon Cohen Symposium, The Ethics of Citizenship. We are so excited to welcome several hundred of you tonight for this online event. We have guests from all over Houston and throughout Texas and beyond joining us for this important conversation led by our incredible panelists. For those of you who are just joining us for the first time, my name is David Scott and I serve as the Director of Lifelong Learning and Engagement at Congregation Beth Israel. On behalf of Rabbi David Lyon and our clergy team, Rosalind Fuchs-Heiken, President of our Board of Trustees, and our entire board and staff of the congregation, we welcome you. This event would not be possible without the leadership of Marcy Zlotnick, who chairs our steering committee, and together with Bob, they created the Lyon Cohen Fund for Jewish Business Ethics. We're so grateful to you both for your leadership and generosity that allows us to hold this event. I also want to give a shout out to Jeffrey Lieber, this past year's winner of the Lyon Cohen Merit Scholarship. Every year we award a $5,000 scholarship to a student currently pursuing or planning to pursue a graduate degree. The scholarship is available to members and family members of the Congregation Beth Israel and is presented on a merit basis to an individual who exemplifies Lyon Cohen's optimism and devotion to Jewish ethics. This year's application deadline is February 15th, 2021. Please visit our temple's website for more information. At this time, I'll turn the program over to Marcy, who will continue with our introductions as we explore the ethics of citizenship. You will note that everyone has been muted for this presentation. And if you'd like to submit a question to our panel, please click the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. Marcy, thank you again, and welcome to the program.
Thanks, David. I appreciate it. I am so thrilled to have so many of you participating in our Ethics Symposium honoring my late father, Lyon Cohen. It's really hard to believe that this is our 5th event, and I want to thank the committee for their tireless efforts to ensure that each event is informative and relevant. Many of the committee members have been involved since the beginning, actually when we brainstormed about how to honor my father. So thank you to Bobby Lapin, Phyllis Cohn, Anita Gaylor, Daniel Gerber, Jacob Lyon, Warren Rich, Lisa Stanton, Les Fox, David Hassett, and Ben Rose. Thank you so much. I'd also like to recognize the host committee, whose names are listed on the flyer. This is our first year having a host committee, and I have no doubt that our great attendance number are a direct result of their efforts. So thank you. You've actually had to promote this event more than once, so I appreciate your patience. And last but not least, thank you, David. You and your team continue to provide us with amazing support. And this year, with the pandemic, the added task of transferring the symposium to an online platform. Thank you so much. Lyon was a man of the highest integrity who was guided by his faith and his genuine kindness to all. The Ethics Symposium series is in recognition and honor of the moral compass, which was really the foundation of my father's life. Over the years, the committee and I have examined a broad range of current topics facing society, from ethics in sports to ethics in media, mental health, business, and now the ethics of citizenship. To help us explore this timely subject, I'd like to welcome our panel. Ed Emmett, former Harris County judge, Joe Strauss, former Speaker of the Texas House, Rabbi David Lyon, Senior Rabbi at Beth Israel, and our moderator, Ellen Cohen, former State Representative, Houston City Council member, Mayor Pro Tem, and yes, my mother. Thank you all for your time and effort, but honestly, thank you so much for your candor and your willingness to share your views. So Ellen, let me turn it over to you.
Thank you, Marcy. And I particularly want to thank Marcy and Bob for honoring Lyon in such a meaningful way. Thank you to all the panelists, all of whom I've had the pleasure of working with. I appreciate your flexibility in the date and location changes. That attitude of flexibility in the date and changes, and your willingness to compromise along with your ethical and moral standards, that's made you who you are. And that is why you continue to be successful in your careers. So to begin with, Is there a difference between ethics and morality? The best definition I could find is that morals is an individual code of behavior based on religious or philosophical principles. And ethics is a rational way of deciding what is good for individuals or society, and a way to choose between competing moral principles, or when there is not a clear right or wrong answer. So to the panel, how would you describe ethics and morals, particularly as they pertain to ethical citizenship? And I think I'll start with Speaker Strauss.
Oh, no.
Oh, yes.
You'd have to start with me. I make it a rule to never go before a rabbi, or I try not to go before Ed Emmett. But as I understood the question, I think the difference, to me, the difference is that morality is personal. Morality is not really spelled out in our laws the way ethics try to be. We have in the state of Texas, we have an ethics commission. We have some ethics laws. They're not the strongest, but we have them, and they spell out do's and don'ts. We don't really have that for morality. That's more personal. It's more, individual and faith oriented in cases. So I make that distinction, that morals are personal, ethics are more public.
Well, since you mentioned faith, then I will switch to the rabbi. Rabbi Lyon, how do you see ethics and morals being different, if they are?
It's a good question. I think Speaker Strauss did a fantastic job speaking before me. I would say, I think about a verse from the book of Deuteronomy that says that God has given us what is right and what is good, which raises a question. Why does it have to say both right and good? It seems to many that what is right and good are simply the same thing, but in fact, they're not. What is right is a matter of our ethics. We learn through the course of our lifetime what is the difference between what is right and what is wrong. But whether it's also good or not is ultimately a matter of judgment. That judgment might come from you and me, but faith would say that ultimately it's God's decision what is good and what is evil. But I believe, and I agree with Joe Strauss, that a matter of morality, what is good or evil, can sometimes be defined by or guided by one's faith tradition.
Judge?
Well, I'm certainly not going to disagree with the speaker and the rabbi to start this program tonight. I agree. Morals are much more personal, and ethics are more how you relate to others and how you impact others. Somebody could take a moral stance that they believe a certain way, but they're not trying to impose that on anybody else. But ethics requires all of us to comport to certain rules that should apply to all of us, regardless of our morals. And so that's kind of the distinction I would make.
Thank you all. Thank you. Well, in a democracy, citizens give up certain things for the betterment of all. Many of us can remember when seatbelts became mandatory. I think in Texas, that was about 1985. And there was great controversy. People were really upset. Who are you to tell me that I have to wear a seatbelt? And I know what's right. I'll wear a seatbelt if I think that it's important. Needless to say, we are facing the same thing when it comes to face masks. Today is a similar dilemma. Do ethical citizens have a right not to wear face masks? Judge, let's go backwards. We'll start with you.
Okay, and I'm gonna. This is not a duck, but I want to make clear something about seatbelts. Because I was there in the legislature when that mandated seatbelts actually passed, and it passed for one simple reason: the federal government said we're not going to give you any more highway funds unless you mandate seatbelt usage. So it really wasn't a great ethical decision on the part of the legislature. But the argument there was whether or not a person wears a seatbelt doesn't affect anybody but themselves. And it took a man named Red Duke to come to Austin. He came down and we all went, yes, sir, we hear you. Because he said, no, it impacts all of society, the cost of society, the medical cost, everything. So seatbelts, that was pretty clear. Something like face mask, and let's face it, the story has changed by everybody throughout the year, but now we're at a point where, here I am at Rice, we have to wear face masks all the time, and everybody does accept the fact here anyway, that if you wear a face mask, you are preventing the spread of a disease to other people. And that's a distinction from the seatbelt, because the seatbelt originally was, well, it only affects me.
Okay, so if you are talking about being an ethical citizen, the question remains, if you're an ethical citizen, do you have a right not to wear face masks?
Not around other people.
Okay. Rabbi Lyon?
Oh, I think the matter becomes, since we're speaking of our role as citizens, when we think about our duty to our fellow citizens in a community that defines us, say Houstonians, we consider citizenship a matter not only of those who are our neighbors because they live here, but also those who visit us, those who are strangers among us, those who may come and go. Our obligation to maintain the well-being of the community is a matter of, it is a moral decision whether we value life as our highest priority. In Judaism, we value life as the highest priority. This is the life that we've been granted and have to make the best of it. Ethics will determine then, what can we do as committed individuals to each other as citizens to preserve that as our highest priority? What demonstration of it is there? And right now, in the midst of COVID-19, although some might have believed that a mask was unimportant in the past, it's become patently clear that a mask is the simplest thing we can do to prevent the spread of the disease. So there is an ethical imperative here to adhere to a common reference, which is the mask, to demonstrate that we're committed to life, and that death is not a choice if we can prevent it.
Speaker?
Yeah, well, agree with both of them, especially remembering my service in the legislature. And Ed, do you always have to rip the Band-Aid off of the legislature? I mean, they didn't do the right thing because it was the right thing to do. On the mask wearing, I just don't understand how this even became a question that rises to the level of being prominent enough to talk about it here. I mean, why wouldn't somebody wear a mask? How did it become part of the division in the country? I mean, I understand how it became part of it, because somebody or a movement wanted it to become divisive. But in terms of just being a good citizen and being an ethical person, of course you wear a mask. And I think that we're just in a really difficult period right now that I hope we get past in short order. But we're in a really tough spot right now where people are not thoughtful about others, and they see that as being weak. I think the science is obviously very clear, and on the more positive side, I don't see very many people not wearing a mask when they're in close quarters, and so it's unfortunate it's even an issue, but it is right now.
Right. I mean, I think that's what we're all saying. It is unfortunate. It's also become politicized. And the fact of the matter is, tonight we're talking about ethical citizenship. And it would seem to me that it's very germane. I mean, the question of, are you an ethical citizen? And if so, does that mean you would wear a mask? Does it mean that if you don't wear a mask, you're not an ethical citizen? We're talking about what's best in the whole picture. And anyway, does anybody want to add to that, to the question of ethical citizenship and face masks?
Well, okay, I'll add something, and that is, when you say something is ethical, people should do it. I think what has caused the controversy more now is some people in government telling people they have to do it, as opposed to the ethical thing to do is wear a mask. And society, I'm trying to think of a clean example I can give of things you should not do in public, but yet the government doesn't tell you you can't do them in public, but the public would shun you if you did. And I think that's where the ethics come in. I mean, I see people all the time, we'll be walking past each other. We both have on masks, but we'll still both get off the sidewalk. So I think the controversy, and it is an election year, but the controversy has come over the fact that various levels of government are telling people they have to do something.
And Ellen, I would add that, and I agree with Judge Emmett, unfortunately, the issue has been raised to a political decision, and it isn't a polarized or political issue at all. If I care about your well-being, I will do all that I can to care for you. And if you care for me, you'll do all that you can to care for me. If it had been framed initially as a means of securing the well-being of our neighbors, and we were reminded of what is a golden rule in Judaism and Christianity too, to love your neighbor as yourself, and to remind others that we have a choice to choose life, which in Deuteronomy we're told that if we're given prosperity or adversity, life or death, choose life. If it was framed in a moral way, in a land that calls itself Christian but is filled with numerous faith traditions and many peoples, we would be able to find common moral ground and therefore choose the ethical way that brought us together to safeguard each other's health and well-being. And masks would be a popular item instead of something that divides certain people.
Okay. Well, what do you do and who decides when ethics collide? And how does faith play into a person's ethics? And I might add, as an elected official or a religious leader, how do you balance your ethics versus your faith? I'm not going to start with the rabbi. It looks like a slam dunk question. Let's go back to Judge Emmett and let's hear what your thoughts are on that.
Well, gee, I would rather have heard the slam dunk answer from the rabbi to start.
I know, but you know, when I mention faith, it actually jumps over to the rabbi. Not, of course, assuming that you don't have the faith, you do. That's why I'm coming to you, Ed.
Well, again, it's back to that separation of faith and ethics. Ethics are something that society accepts as norms, whereas faith, my faith may not be accepted by my next door neighbors on either side. And so I think the question is, society gets to pretty much determine what are the ethical norms. Like the speaker said, we have an ethics commission in Texas, and it sets the norms for ethics. We don't have a faith commission in Texas that says, okay, this is what everybody ought to do relative to their faith. So in my case, ethics is that external thing that I think I should do for the benefit of everybody else. And faith is the thing that, you know, I have well up deep inside of me to help me make it through the day.
Joe?
I can't top that answer. I think I agree with what Judge Emmett said, and faith is personal, and it's not shared. You know, each of us has a faith that isn't shared by others, but we respect those who have differences. And I think the question had something to do with being in public life and faith.
Yeah, as an elected official, how do you balance your ethics versus your faith?
Yeah, well, in my case, frankly, I didn't really think about it all that often. I was too busy trying to do the job, and to herd cats and to get things done. I didn't really think about my own personal situation all that much. I was aware that in my position, it was pretty unusual to be a Jewish Speaker of the House. I don't think there had been one before, maybe one a long time ago. But it never really was an issue for me. Might have been an issue for a few other people and kind of uncomfortable for them. But I never made my personal faith an issue in decisions that I made or how I went about the job. I kept it really separate, and I'm a believer in keeping faith and government, with a good dose of separation. I think it helps to have a certain faith, whatever it is, if you're going to be in a position of significant public service. But it shouldn't overtake your judgment when you are making decisions and trying to help provide guidance for a whole lot of people who are diverse in their views and in their faiths, but respecting other people. So in my case, it really wasn't an issue for me day to day.
And I remember serving on the floor while you were speaker, and you clearly juggled those two things with great savvy. In fact, I do have to say, when you mentioned you may have been the only Jewish Speaker of the House, I'm quite sure. And in fact, there are very few of us that were Jewish at the time. And I remember saying that, the Hispanics would have their quorum in a big room upstairs, and African-American community elected officials would have their quorum somewhere else. And at one point we decided we'd have our Jewish quorum in a phone booth, because that was it.
Ellen, that's probably why in my first term in the House, I was elected the Jewish Freshman of the Year. You may have been too.
I probably was. Rabbi Lyon.
Ellen, Joe, I think that's a really excellent point that you made. I really appreciate your emphasis on the separation of church and state, which I adhere to myself. And I think what you're trying to arrive at is something that we do call in Judaism, I'll use the Hebrew term, derech eretz, which is basically good manners. That when you enter a community, you really look to understand what is the way that people treat each other and guide each other according to morals and principles. And the ethics that you discover are the manners that you want to adhere to as well. So good manners means to be good to each other, to be kind to each other, and to promote each other's well-being, even if that step is different than our own. We have to see the humanity in others and arrive at whether it's a law, a teaching, a principle, or a policy that allows people to find their personal way, perhaps guided by faith as well, to do their very best and to be at their very best.
Thank you. Okay, most pertinent to today's news and the fact that the election is 5 days away, do you believe that citizens have an ethical responsibility to vote? Now, I say this because in 2016, the presidential election, 58% of voters, approximately 138 million people, voted out of over 200 million eligible voters. Now, there are 22 countries presently that penalize people for not voting. Australia, in fact, will penalize you anywhere in terms of American dollars from $14 to $79, depending upon the election, what type of an election it is. There is, of course, exclusions for seniors and people with disabilities, but 22 countries require citizens to vote. Since we only had 58% of our eligible voters vote, what do you all think of requiring people to vote? Joe, how about starting with you this time?
Well, requiring people to vote,
Yes.
or is there a responsibility to vote?
Well,
I
any way
believe
you want to interpret.
I believe very strongly that there is a responsibility to vote. I don't believe that it should be mandated. I mean, it's part of the gift we have as American citizens is the opportunity to vote, the opportunity to have that direct impact on our own government, federal government, our state government, our local government, even our school board leadership, and many others. And so, yeah, I think it's part of being an ethical citizen is to exercise that right. But it's a right. It's not, to me, a mandate. And I don't think that, I don't think that government should penalize anybody for not voting. I mean,
But it's quite interesting.
my mother,
Mhm.
my mother, who was the inspiration for me to be involved in politics, was extremely active as a grassroots Republican back in the 60s. And her father and her mother never voted. They didn't even vote. They lived on a ranch outside of San Antonio, and they just thought voting was a waste of time. Now, they'd complain plenty, but they wouldn't vote. And so, I mean, I think it's fundamental, as a fundamental part of being, a citizen. But mandate, no, and I don't think it would work. I mean, if you can't mandate a mask, how are you going to mandate somebody to vote? I think you'd have a terrible situation. Now, maybe there's some way to incentivize people to vote, but I think it's best the government just encourage people to vote.
Well, I would agree with that, but
I think the message must be getting out, because I've been reading reports that people are showing up.
Yes, indeed. But in terms, I mean, the fact is, it is, as I mentioned, mandated in at least 22 countries around the world, and we've had, less than 58% of the population. I always think of the fact that we have fought wars to bring democracy to countries. So there are people who get up at 2:00 in the morning, walk 5 or 6 miles in snowstorms and rainstorms so they can get their hands stamped so that they can vote. So I feel strongly that it is a privilege and an honor to vote. But again, 22 countries require you to vote. And I mentioned Australia because I think of its relationship to us. And there's a financial penalty if you don't. What do you think, Judge?
I think it's a really bad idea to make people vote. Look at what we have right now. We have people going to vote for president in other races, but when they get down to those various district judges and things, they don't even know who they're voting for. So I think if somebody doesn't have enough within them to go vote, to exercise the privilege, making them go vote, it's almost like Tammany Hall all over again, where, they rounded up everybody and said, you've got to go vote. And by the way, here's who you vote for. No, I think it's a sacred privilege that we have to go vote. I would never want it to be mandated, because I just think that that's the wrong approach. I have to put in an editorial comment here. Dossie Strauss and her group were also inspirations to people like me to get involved in politics. So,
well, when you were talking about Tammany Hall, I think you failed to mention that they also encourage you to vote early and often. So,
well,
Rabbi?
We've had a couple of counties in Texas that voted alphabetically in years past, if you remember. So no, I think it's a bad idea to mandate voting.
Well, I would add, I agree with both gentlemen, but within Jewish history, Jews thrived in democratic countries, communities, and societies. So when Jews came to this country at the end of the 19th century, the beginning of the 20th century, by the millions, it was really an opportunity for them to come to a place where they would be recognized as citizens, to participate in the vote, to participate in government, and to be valued as people who had every opportunity that everybody else did. So there's an ethical obligation to cherish the democracy that we live in, and to know that if we lived in any other place where there was a dictator, an autocracy, or any other brand of government, we might not thrive as well as we do here. So it's a cherished time in Jewish history if we look at the long arc of it and appreciate that getting out to vote preserves what we hold dear, like every other American citizen, and we should do.
Can I add one more thing? While I think it's a really bad idea that government should mandate voting, I do think government has a responsibility to make voting easier. And I've been reading a lot about some of the local community efforts and lawsuits going on in Harris County. And I'm not expert in what's going on there. But I think as a matter of course, modern government should be better at making voting easier. And I think through technology and through just encouragement from government, it should be more people should be participating, not turned off by the process because it's too complicated, or you have to wait in line too long, or it's a hassle, or you have to take off work or whatever. I even spoke to a friend of mine who lives in New York State and is very sophisticated. He's actually worked for politicians and political committees for probably all of his career. And he told me that today he received his mail-in ballot. It was 18 pages long with so many instructions and such lengthy directions. He wasn't really sure that he could fill it out correctly. And if he didn't fill it out correctly, would it be counted? And I worry about some of the obstacles and bureaucratic obstacles to voting that may be an issue next week.
Ellen, I don't want to be cynical by making this comment, but I agree with Joe Strauss first that we need to make voting a privilege, to celebrate the opportunity to be a part of a democratic system that welcomes its citizens to vote. But I think as a rabbi, I would say, and certainly those politicians who wear their faith on their sleeve, where is the faith that if we make voting easy, let the results come as they will? If it's really in God's hands, then let the people do what we're called to do, and let the result be borne out in what the votes and the tallies tell us. Boy, that's a real combination of believing in the people's will and God's will too.
As long as it's secure, it should be made as easy as possible.
Absolutely. I think the problem is everybody says they want voting to be easier, but some of them don't really. But think how far we've come. I'm reading a book right now by Stephen Harrigan, and he goes back to the years when not only was there a poll tax in Texas, but the Democratic primary was for whites only, specifically. And it took a while to do away with that. We've come a long way, but I think the answer is, and whether we can do it or not, the next legislative session, they need to take a serious look at all the different ways you can vote and where you can turn in your ballots, because right now we do have the strange situation where some things aren't legal under Texas law. Yes, they make it easier to vote, but if it's not legal, then how do you have the balance between legality and making it easier to vote? So I think hopefully the legislature will take a serious look at that. I'll be nice, Joe. I won't say that I doubt that they will, but
Hey, you're not hurting my feelings anymore. I'm a former like you.
particularly since you've got me started on this a little bit. You know, when I went to the legislature, there were 24 Republicans and 126 Democrats. And anything Republicans said wasn't going to be right. Then when the Republicans took over, the Republicans took the exact same position that the majority took when the Republicans were the minority. They just switched sides, and we see it all the time. So I'm hopeful that this next session is going to be about 50-50 in the House. Maybe they can come together with an ethical, see how I got the word ethical back in there? Ethical approach to making voting easier. But the problem now is we were about to go with a lot more online voting, electronic, but now I think everybody's scared about not having a paper trail now that we know that foreign countries and others can hack into the systems. And so I'm not an expert in all that, but I do hope the two parties can get together and say, look, this is the way to make it easiest for people to vote.
Well, I know when you're talking about making it easier, just as a matter of interest, you know, we added a week to early voting here this year. And the fact is that tonight, if anyone listening to this hasn't voted and also has a problem with insomnia, the polls, there are 8, I think, places in the city that you can vote for 24 hours. They're open for 24 hours straight. So if you haven't voted and it's 3:30 in the morning, you know, go online, you'll find out where it is and you can go vote. And
Ellen, I will add, we have a congregant who offered that if somebody's having difficulty with transportation to vote, to let us know. We will provide or perhaps reimburse for transportation to be sure that the vote can be made.
At 3 in the morning?
We'll see.
Oh, okay, I just didn't know whether that was.
We have limits too.
Okay, in the realm of politics, how does an ethical citizen balance voting for his or her party's candidate when you know that the candidate has been less than honest in their dealings and morals? How do you judge a candidate, someone you know to be a moral person, against some of the terrible, negative, and false campaign material they're running against their opponent? Ed.
Okay. Well, you've got a couple of questions in there. I mean, on the first part, I've said it publicly, I've never voted a straight ticket in my whole life. So, and the joke has always been, for those of us who have been in partisan politics, we know some of the scoundrels on our own side better than those on the other side. So it's been pretty easy at times to say, no, I'm a Republican, but I can't vote for that Republican. But, you know, the second part of it, the whole, if you know something's unethical going on, how do you raise that issue? I think you just have to. If you know that somebody is doing something that is unethical or illegal, I think you have an obligation to actually talk about it. And because it's not a personal hurt, it's back to what's the role of a government official? It's to take care of the residents, take care of the people of the society. And if they're not doing that, then I think that's why we have these ethics laws.
Rabbi?
I can't speak to the politics of it, but I will say that there is a term that's been used, it's called moral relativism. And it suggests that just because I think it's right, doesn't necessarily mean it's right if it isn't ethical, if it isn't good, if it doesn't contribute to the well-being and the wholeness of our community where we all live and share space. So if we see something that is illegal or untrue, hurtful, polarizing, just because someone says it is true and it is right and it is good, doesn't necessarily mean that it is. So where do we go back to find the common ground where we can find real truth and real morality and ethics? For some people, they go back to their scriptural sources to find what is true and what is right. But I would add this. In Judaism, we speak of mitzvah. It's a good deed. It's a common translation, but it really means a commandment. And it raises the other question, well, if it's a commandment, who's commanding us? Some people say God commands us and we follow suit. Other people are not so moved by that notion, but we are compelled by what we believe to be the right and good thing. We are moved intrinsically by our own humanity and our wish to find humanity in other people too. And if that can be our core, if that can be our common ground, then we would reject out of hand without any question someone who lies, somebody who pits us against each other, who raises unethical statements in political ads, and adhere to that which we know is always right and always good, because we trust that our neighbor might very well be doing the same thing for our sake. And if we can do it, we can find our way to people who are more consistently working on our behalf.
Joe?
You're
Joe,
muted.
you're muted. Okay.
Ed must have done that. Ed began his answer by saying something that Barry Goldwater told my father in 1972 at a very small fundraiser for Senator John Tower's reelection that year. And it was shocking to my father that Barry Goldwater said exactly what Ed said. He said, "I've never voted a straight party ticket in my life. So if it was good enough for the most conservative Republican US Senator, it's been good enough for most of my Republican friends, including me." And so no, I don't believe any party has a monopoly on good or bad people. And we know them when we see them, or we should. And just one other point on this issue. This year, this election is the first election where voters can't just go push one button and vote for every member of a party up and down the ballot. And I'm really happy that that's happening. I was quite involved in getting that law passed. It's something that I believed in long before it passed. But finally, we were successful. I'm sorry that it didn't take effect immediately after it was passed in 2017.
Me too.
Because some very good public servants might well still be in office, some of whom might be on this symposium. But anyway, I think it's an encouraging thing. And straight party voting is not something that I do. I don't vote for a lot of Democrats. And in fact, there's some races where I just can't vote for either one of them. That happened to me this year when I early voted. There was a race or two where I felt equally unhappy about both choices. And I hate to cop out, but sometimes, seldom, rarely, that's what happens.
Gosh, I agree with both of you. Actually, I remember voting for a Republican Speaker of the House. This sort of came to my mind.
Oh, that's different. You had no choice.
Oh, yes, I did. Oh, yes, I did.
Can I add something else? Because
Sure.
you touched on campaign ads, and I'm going to be careful not to mention any specific ones, but because we're all tired of the ads right now. I think. But since we have third-party groups that are now running the most vile attack ads, both directions, and you see them over and over and over, I just wish there was some accounting where somebody would go to the candidate and say, do you condone the ad that they're running against your opponent? And really put people on record like that, because I can't tell you how many times in my life where I've gone up to somebody and said, "You really said that?" And they said, "Well, that's just politics." It's like politics is separate from the governing. Well, it's not just politics, it's people's lives. And frankly, it's why a lot of people, I think, don't want to get into politics because, you know, something they did when they were 18 years old, you know, 40 years ago is suddenly going to be blaring on television on a nightly basis. Oh, by the way, the charges were dropped, but they don't ever tell you that. And so there's got to be a way to hold people accountable. I remember in the last election cycle, Republicans ran some ads or some literature about George Soros and his involvement. And some of the Jewish community got upset about that. They saw it as more of a dog whistle. And so they came to me and they said, what are you going to do about this? It wasn't even my ad. It had nothing to do with my race. But that's not a bad thing. I think you have to be able to make candidates and government officials accountable for what's being said in their campaigns and not let them get away with, well, that's just politics.
Ellen, I would jump in and say thank you for those comments, because I think our ethical obligation is, if we see something, say something. I know that there are people who have complained to me about the nature of politics today, and what can they do? Some are despondent over the nature of politics. Some are motivated by politics today. But in any event, our ethics should urge us to get engaged, to raise those questions about those ads, or if we're upset about something, to call on our legislators and not sit back and be complacent. That's not how we improve the system if we think it's broken.
Okay. Now is something that's a little bit more close to home. If you're comfortable, can you give an example in your own life and or your career where you faced an ethical versus moral or religious dilemma? Rabbi.
Well, I can't begin to count the number of those dilemmas that people bring to me. I've heard it all. I've heard everything. I'll never forget somebody who came to me and said, but Rabbi, I just don't want to do the wrong thing. And I wanted to say, then don't. But that wasn't the right answer to give. But the reality is that we are all faced with so many ethical and moral dilemmas every single day. And just as Joe said earlier, it isn't a matter of holding our Bible under our arm or carrying our Torah with us, but rather trying to acknowledge that if we can engage faith, ethics, morality in all the large decisions that we make, then we will invest in those decisions something that is potentially good and better. But if we regard everything as trivial, or that it isn't worthy of our deepest consideration, then we might overlook something that truly would benefit from our deepest sincerity and genuine contribution. Have I been faced with it? Sure, I've raised 4 children. I've been married for 33 years. We live in a complicated world, and being a rabbi means very often taking the high road when maybe, like others, I'd rather punch him in the nose or take him to court or get angry like other people do. But I constantly have to go back to the sources and say, what does my tradition demand of me? What is the ethical imperative of my Judaism? And I once said to a board of people who were not necessarily minding the Jewish code, and I said, you know, sometimes the role of the rabbi is to impose Jewish values where they're missing. So I'm not a prophet, nor am I the son of a prophet, said a famous prophet a long time ago. But the prophet was never a popular figure. He always came in to say something that needed to be said and nobody wanted to hear it. But that's the purpose of our panel, is to say, in a world of brokenness, we're trying to say it does matter to us. And being ethical and moral in ways that we can do it together is a lot better than ignoring the responsibility.
Joe, Ed?
That was a beautiful way to put it. You know, I was blessed with a short memory. So I'm
Oh,
sure
my.
I've been faced with a lot of these dilemmas, and I probably fell short a few times myself. But I think over the long haul, if you just try to help people come to compromises, help people see a way forward that isn't going to be self-destructive for them or a mistake for them. Serving in the role that I had for a decade, I think John Boehner, when he was Speaker of the House of the Congress, he described the job as being everything from a marriage counselor to a bail agent, to holding confessional a couple times a week, psychiatrist, all of those things. So, I mean, I've seen it all, and most all, and I've been confronted with a lot of different unusual circumstances and ideas. And, I can't think of anything that stands out as particularly impactful, just that we're all human beings and we all have faults and we all have frailties, and none of us is perfect. But I think just trying to encourage people, as the rabbi said, to do the right thing, and to think about it before you do the wrong thing, can be helpful. So that's the role I tried to play.
Thank you. Ed, I'm not trying to put anyone into box you into a corner. It's just, if you have an answer, great.
I do, and I don't want this to sound like, wow, look at me. But, I think too many people in politics, in government, don't make the right decision because they're worried that they're going to lose their position. And that's unfortunate. You have to be willing to lose for doing the right thing, or at least for doing what you think is the right thing. And I'll give you a concrete example. I never wanted to be county judge, never crossed my mind. I moved back here from DC, and Judge Eccles resigned, and they called and said, Emmett, why don't you be county judge? And I said, because I don't want to. And that wasn't the right answer. And so I ended up doing it for 12 years. But that all could have gone off the rails the very first year, because I was a little bit shocked. That was 2007, 2008. One of the big issues was illegal immigration. And suddenly people had discovered that folks had come across the border and they weren't documented. And I kind of thought they were kidding, because I'd lived in Texas my whole life, and I'm going, duh. I mean, really? This is a surprise to you? But there were these groups, and Joe, I'm sure you remember them. And they were just rabid that, you've got to make sure that people who are in this country illegally do not get any services, period. They cannot use taxpayer services. And so I'm up in a primary. And one of the first issues that comes up is the fact that the Harris County Hospital District provides a lot of healthcare services, and a lot of the people who are served, frankly, are undocumented. And so it wasn't an issue that I'd ever even thought about. And so I went to Dr. Palacio, who was about 4'10" tall, and the health director for the county. And she just made it real clear. I said, tell me about this. She said, well, Judge, you don't have a choice. Emergency rooms have to take whoever shows up under federal law. Doctors take an oath to improve people's lives. And oh, by the way, one of your jobs is to make sure, and this is really appropriate today, she said, one of your jobs is to make sure a pandemic doesn't break out in our community. So therefore, we switched completely, and instead of denying services, she put together this whole plan using the federal qualified health clinics, the FQHCs around town, and we just beefed up all the services. And there were a lot of people said, oh, that's the primary is just going to kill you. But it didn't, because the voters understood the rationale behind it, and that those groups never liked me for it, but it was the right thing to do. And then the other issue that became my passion was mental health. And that's something that people don't like to talk about. And so I had the moral decision there of, do I talk about my own family? Do I talk about my father and his mental condition? And I finally just said yes, because that makes it personal. And to this day, I still think too many people don't address mental health issues because they're embarrassed and they don't want their family. But it's a health issue like anything else. The brain's an organ. I mean, we ought to treat it like that. So yeah, those are just a couple of examples that they didn't fall in the normal purview of a county judge, but they were the things that hit me and I had to deal with.
Well, thank you. Thanks for sharing that, Ed. And it sort of takes me to my final remarks before I take the questions and answers. But this last question, based on your responses tonight, and before we begin taking questions, it seems to me that the definition of an ethical citizen is one who builds relationships based on humility, fairness, and open-mindedness, who demonstrates respect, empathy, and compassion, and who through teamwork, collaboration, and communication contributes fully to the community and the world. And our panelists, and I might add my daughter, clearly demonstrate that definition. So I appreciate your honesty and your willingness to be forthright in your answers. And now we have quite a few questions that have come in. I'm going to start with this one, which is interesting because I think it was either Ed or Joe who were talking about immigration. This question came in. The US, as we know, is the land of opportunity. We have welcomed immigrants to this country to such a level that virtually our entire population can trace their roots and ancestors originating from countries all over our planet. How do we reconcile opening our borders with no checks and balances with our desire to remain a welcoming and compassioning country? And the person who sent this in said, I asked this question as an immigrant who was welcomed here 60 years ago and who went through all the lawful steps to satisfy the requirements for citizenship. Who would like to jump in first? Joe, I see you raise your hand.
I think it'd be great for the rabbi.
I will lay a little groundwork at least to tell you that, Jews were strangers in the land of Egypt. The story of the Exodus is our story, but it's not only our story. The whole notion of being liberated, freed from bondage, to arrive in a land of opportunity, to live according to freedoms where we choose the boundaries which will guide us. That's our nature. And the Torah itself identifies the obligation to welcome the stranger at least 36 times. So it's in our DNA, it's inherent to us. And as a land of immigrants, it isn't going away. This is a subject that we have to address. Comprehensive immigration reform is an ethical obligation as citizens to each other and to those who join us that we have to accomplish, dare I say, in a bipartisan way. There's my political input.
Okay.
Joe.
Yeah, I'm a believer in legal immigration and more of it. My understanding, at least as of a few years ago, most of our illegal immigration issues were by people who came here legally on visas and overstayed them and never came back into the system. I think we need to get control of our immigration system. We need to encourage more people coming to this country who want to come here and want to be productive. and who want to participate in the system and pay taxes and be part of our workforce. So, I mean, I get the point of the question, and I'm not for anything that's illegal, but we need to address the shortcomings of our current system and enforce them, but also at the same time, not as a way of saying, don't come to the United States, but as a way of saying, please do come to the United States under these circumstances, and we need you.
You know, everybody has said they're for comprehensive immigration reform, and I'll say it. I mean, we've got to have that, because immigration historically, came across oceans, and you didn't have the border. The border, as I mentioned earlier, being a lifelong Texan, it's pretty much always been an open border in the sense of people went back and forth, and it's only recently that, as Joe said, people have overstayed, not necessarily even on visas. They've come and they've lived here in kind of in the shadows. We can't allow that. We do have to have immigration laws, and those laws do have to be enforced. Like the example I gave earlier, though, people who are here, we can identify them, but we still have to make sure that, they don't die on the street or anything like that. We have to be a humane country. But we've got to get to comprehensive immigration reform. And frankly, I use the example all the time. If you look at, and somebody will get upset with this example, if you look at the caravans that come up, they tend to come up during an election year. And then after the election, the caravans stop. And you go, well, wait a minute, was that really a caravan of people in desperate need, or was that somehow a political stunt? People in desperate need, we need to find a way to help. But immigration is still that hot button issue right now.
Well, there's a follow-up question somebody else asked and said, should resident non-citizen dissidents be deported? And they note that the constitutional term, we the people, has not been defined to apply only to citizens. I mean, do we deport everyone?
If they're here legally, I think that's the question.
The non-citizens, should residents, non-citizens, dissidents be deported?
So if they're here legally, and
Yes,
they're dissident and expressing their opinion, no,
I guess.
No, I don't think so. And if they're doing something to, foment rebellion or creating, a dangerous situation, that's different. But opinions, I mean, gosh, I guess when I went to the French Open last year, I may have said some things that would have been taken as being a dissident in France. I'm glad it threw me out.
We're not going to deport you. Okay, I want to go back to a question that had to do with voting. And one of the people wrote in and said, panelists think that voting is a cherished right. Why do you think that 40% of the people don't take advantage of that right?
I'll
The
take a
screen
swing
didn't
at it.
freeze, did they? No.
I think first of all, I think it will be lower than 40% this year.
Really?
I think it'll be low. It may be lower than 40% before early votings.
I see. Lower of people voting. Right. Okay.
Of those not voting.
Right.
But I think a lot of people are just turned off by politics. I think a lot of people don't vote because too often our campaigns and candidates are trying to suppress their votes, not through using government to physically keep them from voting, but by the rhetoric they employ, by turning people so completely disgusted by the whole system that they say, to heck with it. I hate all those people. Make it go away. And then there are those people who just don't participate because they don't feel invested in any of the outcomes. And there are some people who just can't can't get there for one reason or another, or can't pull it together to figure out how to vote by mail or other alternatives. So I think there's a lot of reasons for it. The main reason, though, I think, are the obstacles to voting and wanting to participate just through campaign tactics and rhetoric.
Ellen, I would add, I think if our theme is ethics and citizenship, if the opportunity to vote, which is a right and a privilege in this country, could be transformed into the ethical privilege that it is, and celebrated. If ads could, if I'm speaking as an idealist here, as the rabbi who talks about ideal morals and ethics, if ads were not negative and tearing people apart, but rather championing one's own message, what can I do for you, the people, then we would all be inclined to vote to celebrate a person we champion and we want to lead us. And if it were made easier, as Joe and Ed have said, then there's no barrier to participate in something that we celebrate and consider one of the greatest opportunities and privileges we have as American citizens. But that's not going to happen tomorrow. So I'll keep praying.
Well, I think a lot of people don't vote just because they don't respect the political process. And it's not even just the negativity. They say these people don't understand us. They see the candidates as not relating to them, and at the risk of causing eyebrows to raise. I think that's one of the secrets to what happened in 2016 with President Trump. There were a lot of people who came out that hadn't voted in a long time because the drain the swamp rhetoric and things actually touched them somehow, and they showed up. This time there are a lot of other people showing up, pushing back against that, I have a feeling. But, you know, if somebody is turned off by politics, again, I really don't want them voting. Of course, one of the problems we have, I've got to get this in as an editorial comment too, the two parties tend to go off to the fringes now that we have redistricting done by computers, and the districts are pretty much drawn one way or the other, and the primaries determine who wins for the most part. That's changing a little bit now at the end of the decade of redistricting, but at least three of us, Rabbi, I'll leave you out of this one, at least three of us know that once the districts are drawn again after this census, they're probably going to be very partisan districts one way or the other. And it'll just be the changes over the decade that make it work. That's why being a countywide official, whether it's me or Judge Hidalgo or anybody else, you have to deal with a whole county. And that's better than having to deal with a carefully drawn district where you only have to care about one party.
Well, I'm going to wrap this up with the last question. And we talked a lot about trying to do something about getting more people out, what we can do. And this question says, regarding our responsibility to vote, to what do you attribute the record early voting turnout and probably record overall turnout? To what extent did Harris County voting innovations play a role? And how should voting in Texas continue to be improved to allow more of us to exercise this responsibility of citizenship? And to that, I would say some of the things that I mentioned before, we have added to early voting. We do have, for the first time, a 24-hour day of voting. But what else might we be able to do? You know, we vote on Tuesdays. That goes back to farming communities and taking your products to market and getting back home for whatever. You know, a lot of places they vote on Saturdays, which seems to make it a lot easier, except, well, you know, maybe for Orthodox Jews, I will grant that's not a good idea. But what can we do so that we do increase it? And do you think that some of the things we've done has helped the turnout rise? And I'll let you Ed, why don't you start, and we'll go from Ed to Joe and to the rabbi.
Well, I think there are a lot of things that have been done. And personally, I don't know why we don't go to these regional voting centers, leave them open all the way up through the election. The fact that we still have to shut down the machines and parcel them out to people's garages and scout houses and things for the precinct vote, that's a throwback to an earlier era too. I don't know why the regional centers just can't stay open all the way through election day and do that. The mail-in voting, I don't even want to get into that. That's gotten to be such a partisan thing, but they're called mail-in ballots for a reason. You're supposed to mail them in, not drop them off at some spot. But if people don't trust the post office, then I don't have any problem at all with, people being able to get their ballot and take it and turn it in at any of these regional voting centers. I mean, why can't you just walk up to a legitimate voting center and turn it in? Other places have drop boxes where you can do it. All that makes sense, but ultimately we're going to have to figure out what we do with these computers in front of us. And is that going to be something that simplifies voting, or is that going to be so toxic because of the ability to be hacked? But again, I'm going to end where I started. I just think both parties have a chance to get together after this election and rewrite the rules for how voting occurs so that we don't have lawsuits filed the week before the vote.
Thank you. Joe?
Yeah, no, I agree with everything Ed said. In Bexar County, where I live, there's only one drop box, and it hadn't been an issue or a flashpoint at all that I'm aware of, just the way it is. I don't know that many people utilize it anyway, or would if there were multiple locations. So I think that's been a bit of a kind of a manufactured flashpoint. I think it is a positive thing that the governor lengthened the early voting period, and I think it's paying dividends. Be interesting to see when all the votes are in, whether this very strong early turnout is because of the lengthened period, and whether it ends up not being that much larger of a turnout than 16, whether people just shifted the way they vote and when they vote, or whether all these new registrations turn out to be new voters. It'll be a fascinating exercise to look back at that. So I agree with that also, that technology is going to be the key to the future of making voting more accessible, easier. And I think it will happen. I just don't know how quickly. But technology obviously is changing our lives in so many ways. I think voting is going to be following right along. And I think a lot of these lawsuits that have been filed back and forth, and voting by mail versus not allowing more voting by mail if you don't fit the description of 65 or disabled. And I think I wrote an op-ed a few weeks ago saying that
It was very good too.
that we should relax those restrictions during a pandemic. That if you don't feel if you feel like your health is in some jeopardy being around other people right now, and you're not 65 years old, then you ought to be allowed to use a mail-in ballot and safely and securely. A lot of the accusations about ballot fraud, I think, are exaggerated. I saw the lieutenant governor, I think, made a statement today on a radio program saying that if Donald Trump loses, it'll be because it was stolen. The only way he could lose. Well, that's not the only way somebody can lose an election. You can lose an election by not getting as many votes as your opponent does. That kind of rhetoric is just, continues to be harmful. So anyway, I think there are ways to make voting easier. I think it's also incumbent on candidates in the future to encourage people to want to vote and participate. And long term, I'm an optimist once we get past this bump in the road next Tuesday. I hope that we don't see another one like it anytime soon.
Thank you. Rabbi?
Well, I'll reflect on what Joe and Ed have said so well. The truth is that it is ethical to enable people to do what is their right to do. We generally in Judaism, we can be passionate about certain issues, but it isn't in passion that we make our best decisions. And a lot of the elections and candidates in recent times have drawn us apart from each other by being passionate for the right or passionate for the left, passionate for the good or passionate for what we think is the evil, and pointing fingers at each other. Ethics is not about the black and white areas. Ethics is about the gray areas. If you look at the quantity of text in Judaism, for example, the amount of text on how to light a candle or say a prayer or keep an observance are small by comparison to the tomes written on ethical issues in business, the marketplace, and other matters of life between people. So if we can step away from the passionate outer edges and find the reasonable place in the center where ethics help to resolve the day-to-day issues, then we can step away from that polarized edge and find an easier way to participate in simply the life and the government and the politics and the diplomacy of our country. But these polarized edges are making us into passionate people, and we don't need to be passionate about everything. We just have to be good. We have to be fair. And I think, Ellen, many of the adjectives that you used in your closing statement that you shared a moment ago are right. To be empathetic, to be caring, to be loving, to show deference to each other, and sometimes to know that to step back from our position may be a better place to be than constantly being up front and center, and to give everybody a place to express themselves and to vote.
Well, thank you. And I thank our panelists and everyone who has turned in tonight. Clearly, I can't believe anybody watching hasn't voted, but if you haven't, you can do it tonight and through tomorrow, early voting. And then, of course, Election Day is Tuesday. And I want to say that I always feel when I say the judge, the speaker, the rabbi, and the mayor pro tem, I always feel like the next line should be walked into a bar. It just feels like the opening for something. But you all
Let's do it.
You all have been terrific. I'm extremely grateful. Finally, I say to you and to everyone watching, please be sure to mask up, wash up, and distance yourself. Stay safe, and I will now turn it over to David Scott. Thank you again.
Thank you, Ellen, and thank you so much to our panelists and to each of you for joining us this evening. After the program, you'll be directed to a survey to complete. Additionally, we look forward to welcoming you back on November 10th at 7:30 p.m. for our Wolf Tumim Distinguished Lecture Series, featuring a special conversation between Rice University Professor Emeritus Stephen Kleinberg and our own Bobby Lapin, President of the Jewish Federation of Greater Houston and past President of Congregation Beth Israel. They'll discuss the impact of this election and how Houston is on the cusp of a changing America. Please visit our website for registration information. Thank you, everybody, and have a good night.